Thank you. I said to Des last week, I'm going to try and do a talk without showing any pictures of buildings, but I relented, and so I've got some pictures of buildings here. In fact, I've got quite a few pictures, but I won't angle on them long. Jess said, does everyone in your office really like sport? And funnily, it was only last week we worked out it's only about 15% of what we do, but because it's high profile, everyone thinks that we do sport. And in fact, we don't do sport at all. That happens to be an outcome of some of our interests. We're a practice that is really intensely interested in public architecture and the future of the city, and we've built a practice around exploring what's required to do to produce work in a public realm, and particularly work that has some meaning in a public realm. And so what I thought I might do tonight is talk less about projects, except as examples about the things that aren't to do with design and drawing and all of the conventional things that we learn at university and we end up spending most of our day practicing. But what we actually do is try and work out how, by hook or by crook, we can get something up in an environment that doesn't always focus or allow for clear ideas to be expressed in an architectural sense and help create public space. So I thought tonight, if there's any questions, ask them as we go. There's nothing worse than having someone standing in front of you with 150 slides banging on about stuff. Please ask questions. I'd like it to be an interactive thing. I suspect you'll get more out of it, and there's no such thing as a silly question. So please feel free to interrupt as you go. This is our office in Melbourne. We've got studios around Australia and in some countries overseas as well. In fact, just on this slide here, there's my friend Patrick, who I met on my first day at university 30 years ago. We practiced together. In fact, the same day I met Fiona, my wife, who's here tonight. And it's interesting to run a practice and do all the things you'd like to do in your life. It's very much a partner idea. There's nothing I can't do enough in a day by myself. So what we end up doing is we end up doing silly things like coming down to Deakin for a date tonight because it gives us an hour in the car each way. So those sorts of things are what you need to do really to be able to raise a family, have a good relationship and practice architecture at the same time, or other things that Fiona's doing. So I met Fiona and Patrick on my first day at university, and in retrospect it was actually a pretty serious day in my life, but it's been great fun in a sense. One thing I thought I would show, I wasn't going to show you this, but one of my kids said to me on the weekend, Dad, you should show them that when you do the lecture. Just to prove it, we do actually sometimes prepare before we start to give us a lecture or a conversation. So this is actually the structure I did on the whiteboard at home about what I was hoping to say, what I was trying to get across, and some of the evidence that we could produce. So we sometimes do put a little bit of work into how we structure things. So I suppose in some respects, I'll just step back a little bit about our practice and why we do the things we do, if you like. In some senses, I don't think anyone will accuse us of having a style. We don't have a house style at Cox. We don't have lots of yellow sticks or whatever the case may be that identifies our work. But strangely enough, over time, you can start to see the clues of the philosophy behind it. And in some senses, that's my sort of overarching message tonight, is that if you don't have a north point and a philosophical position, how can you continue to deal with such a constantly changing world and so many inputs that all architects are exposed to in the course of any particular project? So the two main drivers that we like to focus on as a practice really are about typological evolution, and we focus very heavily on doing different sorts of public building types. So we do convention centres, we do schools and universities, we do hospitals, we do stadiums, we do public work. Railway stations in particular is a favourite topic of ours because it's actually a really great public events platform. And what we try and do is move them into the next realm. I'm not that interested in what the last railway station or the last convention centre was doing. What I really want to look at is what the next one's doing. So to evolve the type and to start to hybridise the type. And it's interesting over the last 10 years that hybridisation, or the planners call it mixed-use developments, are starting to get more and more traction as people realise that vibrant cities actually need to have more than one thing going along. So some of the more classic planning strategies of industrial over here and residential over there have actually done a disservice to our cities. But I'll come back to that in a minute. The other component, apart from typological evolution, really is about the public life. And so we do see our projects as a public events platform. And in some senses, the way we describe it is we do the stage set, but the play continues to evolve. And you need to understand the play in some detail to be able to design a stage set that is of relevance to that play. But the reality is that the buildings and our public spaces change much slower than society changes. And so you need to get some fundamentals right that will transcend the here and now if you want the work to have meaning and the investment that a society will make in that space to have meaning over time. And it can be 10 years, it can be 100 years, it can be 1,000 years. So that sort of time frame does provide some onus upon us to get some fundamentals beyond the immediate transitions right. Some of the techniques at the secondary level that we like to use really are about the idea of structure. In some senses, that's about doing more with less. You know, we are in the act of building, we are in the act of shelter. How do we do that? How do we hold it up? It's not a case of decorating a conventional structure. It's usually about how can we have a structure that starts to express its act, ideally use less material than it could in other ways. Amy Park, for example, uses 10 times less steel per seat than the Bird's Nest of the Beijing Olympics. And that's not by accident, it's because it was very much a driver of using less material to do the same job. So structure and its craft is very interesting. And the idea of that craft is about how we put the tectonics together, how buildings are actually associated. Our cities are awash in projects that are effectively assembled. They're kit parts. I'd like to be able to specify items out of a catalogue, clip them together, trades come through. They can all become very much the same if you're not careful. So the idea of getting craft into your project is actually pretty important to how meaning comes through. And then the idea of art, and again, we've all got a different view of art. You know, art is what I like. And some people say art is something, if I don't understand it, I don't like it, it's not art. So the idea that there is actually meaning beyond the sum of its parts is pretty important, and that's an evolutionary part of it. And the last part of it is nature. And by that we mean environmental positions. It's about working with what the site is telling you about, not against what the site's telling you about. We had an interesting moment last year when one of the board members from one of the major construction companies came and spoke to us. And I said, oh, by the way, we've worked out you guys have done more 5- and 6-star building than anyone else in Australia. And we had no idea. It's not a metric that we keep. I mean, say, 5-star environmental design, it's like seatbelts on aeroplanes. It's not something that you should be proud about. It's something that should be a mandatory gate that you get through just to get into the next stage. So for us, that sort of stuff is not actually an idea. It's an essential. Like oxygen is not an idea. What is going to actually drive a future project? And so putting all those things together actually brings us up to the idea of character or the phenomenology. What does it feel like to walk into a space? And I'm less interested in the sermon on what it is all about. And if you don't have the, the book of the meaning of the words and why that particular facade is pixelated in a particular sort of way, you don't understand it. It's actually an emotive thing. And so some of these things can't be written down, they can't be described. It actually involves the act of drawing. And the act of drawing starts to unlock parts of your brain that other techniques for visualisation don't allow you to do. So we're one of the practices who are very highly skilled and believe in building information modelling, rendering. We've got virtual reality studio. We've got all sorts of things happening. But actually, the thing that we regard as most valuable is the ability to listen and the ability to move the pen across the page. So in some senses, we've come full circle, and it's the core stuff that we've been doing for millennia that actually count in how we do things. We've got some more sort of complicated ways in which we describe that in terms of where is our north point, what is our ethos, what are our projects, how have we evolved them, and what are the processes that we do. But it's all driving towards what is a future city and how do they come together. And what's our role within that future city? Because we can't delude ourselves that the architect is someone all-powerful with a pen. But we are in a strangely influential position to start to influence the pressures that start to come upon how a city is put together. Now, I suspect that we've all learnt, I presume you've all done enough of your professional practice to talk about the stages of the project. You know, there's the briefing stage, concept design, and all this sort of stuff. And this is all pretty conventional stuff. Interestingly enough, it's never quite the same for every project. So every project we do in some ways is a prototype of process as well as a prototype of project. But one of the things I'd like to talk to a little bit about today is what happens before the briefing. So public architecture for us is about what happens before the question is asked. How do you frame the question how do you start to be involved in the debate about what the question from which a brief, from which a project will come? So you have to go further back in sort of root cause analysis to really understand how public architecture comes about and what influence we can have on that. Because sometimes the influence can be well before a brief has come out. So we do need to start working our way through that. And if you do want to start talking about future cities, you actually need to understand them at a fairly a demographic, a geographic and an economic level. We can get very tied up in our solutions, our answers, but in fact, we sometimes forget to look at the question that we're asking. So if you'd like to look at where future cities are going, you need to find out where the future jobs are. And that's not an easy question to answer. But if we don't understand where our future employment, where our future economic activity is going, everything else is just wallpaper. And so in some senses, you look at Melbourne, for example, we have a number of particular high intensity. The city itself, including South Bank, Docklands, and the sort of the Royal Park University Medical Health and Research area, is one of the two major engine rooms of economic growth in Australia. So it's a very serious piece of economic kit. Large chunks of Australia hang off that. And that has moved its way down towards Dandenong, which is one of the major industrial areas of Australia. We all have heard reference about the decline of industrial manufacturing in Australia and so forth. Don't believe it all, it's just changing. And then in the middle, of course, we have the Monash and Clayton sort of effectively economic and innovation centre. Monash University, CSIRO, we've got synchrotron here, Monash Medical Centre, the new hospitals, the research. There's quite a lot of work going on out there. And so in effect, the belt between Dandenong and the city is really where the future jobs are going to be. We think. The fact is we don't know. But I suspect that that's what will continue to occur. Those jobs will change. I read an interesting article a few weeks ago about 3D printing, and it claimed that it thought that 3D printing was going to have a bigger impact on the world than the internet. Now, I'm not so sure if I buy that, but what I am prepared to say is it's going to have a much bigger impact than I think most of us understand already. Monash University have already 3D printed a jet engine out of very sophisticated alloys and very sophisticated tolerances. So what happens when you suddenly need a part somewhere in the world and you can download a file and 3D print it? What does that mean for manufacturing? And what does that mean for economies that have been built around cheap labour to process stuff and to assemble stuff? What does that mean for the future of the manufacturing industry in China? I don't know. But I suspect what the trends will be is that the power of the intellectual and creative capital will continue to rise to the surface, while the ideas of the production and so forth will continue to change quite rapidly. So what we do need to understand is that a future city is one that brings people together to allow that creative spark to occur. And that's actually where cities come into their own. The idea that people can come together, running into people in the street, discussion, creation of ideas, that sort of frisson is really where the creative capital will start to be generated and flourish and encouraged to occur. So while that's all really good, what we've also done in the last 30 years in Melbourne in particular is that we've dislocated where our housing is from where our jobs will be. And it gives us an enormous problem as a city. Now, Melbourne's not unique in this, and in some ways we've got easy solutions to this problem in some cities in the world. But the fact is that if you look at where the future growth will be from, over the next period of years, and all this stuff's on plan, but it's actually pretty it will start to show where our residential components are coming, and they're separated from where the jobs are. They're separated from where the majority of our schools are, and from where the majority of our health services, our sporting facilities. So what does that mean? What it means is that it's a bugger to drive down to Geelong from Melbourne at this time in the evening because of the traffic. But it's a bugger driving around Melbourne, and it's a bugger driving back to Melbourne. The infrastructure that we have can't support the dislocation that we've created between where our jobs are, where our education is, and where we reside. So there's suddenly massive amounts of more vehicle movement per person than there ever has been before. And that creates some issues for us. And as far as we can see, that really starts to talk about two possible outcomes. The first possible outcome is build more stuff. All right, let's build more stuff where the people are. But it's such low density. How can you do that? How can we support 5 MCGs in Melbourne? How can we support 5, medical research centres? We're supporting 2 potentially. Pretty hard to support 5. What do we do about all of the issues to do with universities? So the things that we need as a city can't actually be continued to be replicated. The city doesn't have enough critical mass and it doesn't have enough wealth. So when you're an architect and being asked to design a public building, what you're being given is an extraordinary privilege. A society, and every culture in history has its own ways of disseminating this, but when a society says we wish to build something, and it might be a hospital, it might be a railway station, it might be whatever it is, it actually is also saying, therefore we won't build something else. So every time you do something, it needs to work as hard as it can, and it means that there's some real onus upon the designers to make sure that we get it right. So the idea of building more is good, but there's actually not possible to build enough. The other answer, of course, is to build better transport links between them. Now, I think we've almost hit the end of the road. Roads are very useful, we've got them, but every time we build more roads, I feel like we've got cars as quick as a wink. So how do we do that? And so one of the reasons that we love rail transport in particular is that we think that the stations themselves become a very important part of the link. We don't see railway stations, we see portals into everything. So you jump into a railway station at South Morang, that's your portal to the MCG, it's your portal to the National Gallery, it's your portal to Fence Square, it's your portal to the whole the city has to have, education, employment and health. So you need to start to understand those sorts of things within that culture. So part of the idea of generating public architecture is looking ahead beyond the briefing to look at what generates work, how do we advocate for work, good work, and how do we start to initiate that? And it can happen. And so while there's an incredibly complicated political, social, economic dance about how projects are devised and funded, and we don't have our hands on any of those levers, we actually have more influence than you would think if we choose to start to use it. And so I thought I'd run quickly through a little bit through a project, the Adelaide Oval, both in a relatively conventional sense, as a conventional project, and then suddenly what happened when it changed a little bit. And it's just a story to let the part tell the whole, and tell me if I'm banging on too long. So this is the Adelaide Oval in 2006, sweet little place. So it was the prettiest cricket ground in the world where we were arriving in form. And we got a knock on the door in 2006 from a chap who said, "Oh, look, I'm from the Adelaide Oval and got a meeting next week, and I don't think it's going to go very well, but it might be really well, and if it does, you'll never see me again. But if it doesn't go well, can you be my plan B?" We said, "Oh, okay, that sounds good." So we got a phone call a week later saying, "Oh, look, can you be our plan B?" And so we went over there, and they had been proposing to work on the Western Stand, which is this building right through here, which has got these sort of delightful brick arches and a pavilion in the middle and so forth. And we had a walk around the Adelaide Oval spent a day literally walking through it, going into the old Heritage Scoreboard. There was a game on at the time, a sort of Sheffield Shield game, I think, and there was about 20 people watching, which is symptomatic of some changes that are occurring to some of our sporting events happening globally. And we sort of came to the conclusion that it was actually one of the prettiest places in the world. Unfortunately, it wasn't the architecture that was pretty. In fact, we had to point out, standing in the middle of it, that actually it was a pretty damned ordinary place, really. The delight was between the stands, the delight was the connections, the delight was its context, not what frankly was a fairly ordinary series of things around the car, around it. So we then went through a process, and I'll go through this relatively quickly because, and again, this is a conventional public commission. So we've been asked to get involved, we've gone there, we've made some comments, they'd said, "Oh, that sounds interesting, what can you do for us?" And so we got literal with the things that we felt were very important about that. What made that place, what made that Adelaide, not Perth or Melbourne or Los Angeles or Dusseldorf. There's something about that. And so we then ended up moving into what we called the Western Stand project. And we looked at the ideas of pavilions. Pavilions were very important. And again, we talked about the Great Veranda, the Grand Promenade, the atrium, and evolving the structure of the ground itself and of the buildings that we were talking about. And again, the pavilion really was the idea that there was a hierarchy. It wasn't a stadium. There were ideas of pavilions having gaps between them in the park. And again, so you can start to see some of the early sketches about how that could start to come together and how what had been the Western stand could in fact change into a pavilionised structure that really has a centrepiece with some hierarchy. The veranda being a place where, in Adelaide, in cricket, it gets bloody hot, 40 degrees. You know, you don't want to sit in the sun. The idea of the veranda being something that is able to mediate between inside and outside in an environmental sense, but also being the stage set again where that social act happens, and so we sort of line the outside edges of the buildings with veranda and how that could start to take place. And again, the idea of shades, moving fans and so forth. Looking at the vaults that existed there. The Grand Promenade, something we'd never seen before actually, which is that there's because of the way in the history of the ground, there's actually a promenade that you can walk around here. And what happens is that there's 30,000 people come into a stand that only had 10,000 seats, and all had a lovely time and had a party in the back, a bit like at a Flemington racecourse, you know, have a party in the car park, never see a horse. And what people would do is they'd do the odd circuit through here, and they'd see all their mates and they'd make a time and a place to meet each other in the course of a day. So it's actually quite a special thing to do. So you've got to understand the social structures of it. And so we continue to let that occur. And the atrium itself really was about trying to provide that sort of mediated sense in the middle and through here that looked after the old building and also put forward a position. So that was the Western stand, and you're thinking, oh, that's pretty conventional. You know, it was a lovely thing. It took us around 3 years, I suppose, between the front and the end. And we're very happy with the outcome. But then things started to change. And is anyone here from Adelaide? You've lived there?
Yeah.
How long for?
Went to high school and uni.
Right.
There, and a few years after that, so probably at least 11 years. 11 or 12.
How do footy and cricket get on?
Sorry?
How does football and cricket get on?
They don't.
No, exactly. So what happened in Adelaide was football and cricket hate each other's guts. It's hard to imagine from this distance, but it's the Hatfields and the McCoys. There's reasons for it, and frankly, probably quite good reasons, but I won't say more because of defamation laws. But football had been kicked out of the Adelaide Oval 40 years ago, and they'd been fighting each other ever since. And they had carefully built themselves a pretty dismal place out at West Lakes called Football Park, and the Adelaide Oval stayed home of cricket. And they had been caught as a city, not clever. You've got 2 decaying venues, you've got 2 declining audience participations. Even the mad South Australians have finally got sick of going out to Football Park. The attendances were beginning to plummet. They sold plenty of memberships, but no one would want to go there because it took an hour in the car and it was crappy when you were there. Spend an hour in the car park trying to get out of the place again. And the Adelaide Oval itself was delightful in its gaps, but decaying around its space. And again, 20 people would come to a Shield match. It's not exactly right. So the smart thing for a city to do is actually to combine them together, just like the MCG does. But we've found it very difficult to do that. And so in terms of how does a city go about doing that, neither of the heads of those 2 particular codes could be seen to be talking with each other because that would be seen to be a betrayal. And so we ended up getting a black commission, if you like, where we had to see whether or not we could get 50,000 people around the Adelaide Oval and not ruin the ground. That was literally the one-liner commission. And so we did a black ops operation to see whether or not we could do that and whether or not it was possible to keep the integrity of the Adelaide Oval intact while we beefed its population up to about 50,000, which is the same as Edinburgh. And we ended up having secret meetings at airports. Literally, people weren't allowed to fly into particular towns. We ended up with a meeting with the South Australian Premier and Treasurer in an office in Melbourne because they didn't want to be seen in South Australia to be talking about this with anyone. And it actually happened. But it took a lot of time and it took an enormous amount of effort relative to having to get football and cricket both to approve that. So we would do things such as go on 1-week road trips through rural South Australia, presenting 3 times a day at the local cricket club, at the local pub, lunchtime at the bowls club, to all of the members, because we had to get more than 75% of the members to vote in favour of it to occur. And we got that. We got 80%, which I didn't think we were going to get it. Idi Amin didn't get a vote like that when he was rigging the election. So it was actually fantastic to be able to do that. And what it's meant is that the reason it got up is that we were able to advocate for a better city as a result. And if anyone's been to Adelaide since the Adelaide Oval was finished, it has had a transformational impact on the city. And it's not because of the architecture. I mean, we like to kid ourselves at it, of course, but I actually think it's because it's about the urban context, the fabric and the belief of the city. Of course, you build the world's best event precinct, 5 minutes walk across a bridge from the main railway station in the city as a whole, in the middle of a beautiful parkland with all sorts of shops and laneways and so forth. It's great. The city comes alive. And so instead of getting to the ground being a real problem like it was at Football Park, what happens now is that the football clubs all have emissaries out at the fast railway stations. So when you get to your Gawler railway station, there's already flags and people are handing out and selling footy records. The game has started. You come into town. You can stay there afterwards. Perhaps you take someone who doesn't want to go to footy in the town and they go and see a movie. You catch up and have dinner afterwards. So it's actually changed the way in which people attend those events. But what's even more important is that it's changed South Australians' view of public transport. Hey, getting the train to the footy on Saturday was pretty good. I might catch it to work. So it's actually transformed the attendance of public transport within South Australia. And so, look, I'll very quickly go through. You guys can probably see this quicker than I can describe it in terms of, where would you put a 50,000 seat venue in South Australia? Funnily enough, you'd put it within 500 metres of this chunk of the best public transport in South Australia. Of course you would. You wouldn't build it out at the boondocks. You'd put it where the transport is. You'd make sure it was uniquely South Australian. You would make sure you retained the positions of the critical components of the ground itself. Everyone loves the North Mound and the Moreton Bay Figs. Well, we gave them more North Mound back. That's an important thing to do. The heritage scoreboard has been enhanced. And the idea that there's now a series of pavilions still around the park actually works quite well. And so, for some reason, it just goes off. They get 50,000 here every weekend, which in a Melbourne context would mean that we have an MCG would have to be 200,000 large and it would have to be full every weekend. So they get 5% of their population comes here. And when it goes off, I was there one night when you couldn't hear the 3/4 time siren. Thank God it was allowed a siren in the legal, they would have blamed us. But as it turned out, everyone was just going bananas. So the idea that public architecture is not about the assemblage of the architecture, that's a skill that we all should develop, we will continue to develop. But you need to try and understand the things that drive it. So our ability to turn it from a Western stand into the Adelaide Oval really comes down to the ability to draw, the idea of making place, ground plane. It's not just a stand, it's a whole series of places that people can go and inhabit. The idea of those delightful sails and the pavilions over the top of them, and it works really well. You can now have drinks among the Moreton Bay Figs. The arrival into it from the Riverbank Plaza. There's a roof terrace up there. We argued for a roof terrace to go forth. No one understood the roof terrace. It's a public dining room. It's a large. We managed to convince them to spend the money on a concrete paved area instead of a tin roof above the dining room. It took people 3 days on the first test match to work out that it was there, and it sold beer. And so they ended up with a real problem halfway through the third day where it had hit capacity. They were about to be in breach of their building approval because there was too many people there. And I said, we've got to shut it down. This is a disaster. And this is very clever, one guy who was working on the bar said, don't shut it down, just reverse the escalators. And they did. And suddenly it was able to be managed. And they sold more beer here that day than they have ever sold underneath the scoreboard, which the bar under the scoreboard traditionally has been South Australia's best-selling pub. And so the idea that there are particular rooms that overlook, for example, like this cathedral room that really sort of honours that view, how people come in. I'm not, the purpose of today is not to bang on about the ideas per se, but the Mayor of Adelaide's there. But the idea that there's a whole series of spaces into which you can occupy, you can come together tribally. This is an image that was sent to us from someone. So people are sending us their favourite photos of the Adelaide Oval. And the idea that it actually is made up of the brass and so forth that really is a bronzy of the park in which it sits. And again, the idea that you can start to set it up for particular events. And again, it's going to transcend sport. Here we go. So cricket is on, the Crows are on, home for Port. Within a couple of hours of the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, this came up in the tricolours. So they said, hang on, we want to actually support France in this sense. And so the way in which the South Australian was able to do that is they converted their southern stand into a tricolour support for France. So that's sort of, it's very literal, it's very simple in some senses, but there's also something sort of fairly fundamental about how your public buildings should be able to express more than just the sum of their parts. I think I've spoken about the urban regeneration, of course, and of course the Rolling Stones, when they finally did get there. One of the guys who helped us put it together from government got a couple of tickets, and he was pretty excited. And so he actually texted his dad. This guy's, he's a senior public servant. When I say he's sort of 65, he looks about 75. But he's a terrific guy, and there's a real driving force behind him. He got quite excited about it when he was there. And so he texted his son, who's in his mid-40s in London, and said, oh, look, I'm at the Rolling Stones concert. I think I'm the oldest bloke here. And his son texted back and said, Dad, have a look at the guys on stage. So, but it's about being a city venue in that sense. And in some senses, it's not about the architecture, it's about the social contract. People gather because they have a need to exchange a social contract. We're very social animals, and we need good spaces for that to occur. We need to feel secure. And so in that sense, public work, it does need a context. And so, again, the power of advocacy. North Melbourne Station started life in our office as a disabled access audit. They were concerned that the old ramps were no longer compliant. How can we make this station compliant? Well, 3 or 4, years of work later, suddenly it's become something like this, and it actually has worked very well. But even in that sense, 85% of the passengers at North Melbourne don't get off out of the station; they just transfer to trains. But even that has a context, and so we spend as much time outside the station, drawing and advocating for stuff that has never happened. Right, but it means that the reason that this concourse is here is so it can stitch back into the fabric of North Melbourne, as seen from the old concourse, which was at this end, and actually went from nowhere to nowhere. So the idea of having a future position is really important in how you put some stuff together. And just quickly, as another example of that, this is South Morang Railway Station. You might see a theme here. I really love Morang. But again, here, it's a classic Australian growth suburb. I think it's the quickest growing in Australia. That mantle changes hands, and it depends on the metric that you're after. Some people say it's down at Pakenham, some people say it's at Werribee. It's one of those. But what we have here is classically we have a shopping centre, and we have the town hall, which is sort of the 1980s edifice on the hill, and we have vast tracts of low density housing. And not much else. So what can they have? How can we start to transform a place which we're going to put a railway station in? There's no structure plan. And so we ended up having to do a structure plan on the fly without a commission. So we ended up just drawing one so we could make sure that any station building that was put through could address future growth within that area. And so we started to say, well, look, if the station's probably about right here, it actually becomes a position that's on the fulcrum between the retail and cinemas in through here and up into the town hall and performing arts precinct up through here. But there's actually a structure of urban connection that we need to start to think about. How we can start to get multi-modes like bus, tram, rail interconnections and so forth. We talked about that being a significant piece because it's going to set the standard for what happens in that urban corridor. The idea that the shelter in through here. The idea that there's obviously a landscaping needs to come together, and the idea of what future opportunities. So we've already started to identify half a dozen different sites that we can start to build something. It won't happen as part of this project, it might happen for 5 years or 10 years, but it can happen. So you make sure that you allow for the sites themselves to be viable so they can actually start to generate urban fabric in the long term. The bits of Melbourne or Geelong or wherever you are from that people like tend to be the older, more established areas because there's a density of occupation there before you got stuck in such planning marine. And so we ended up doing what we call the precinct plan for 2030 and away it went. And it's actually, day one was fine, but it's important that we know that day 30 will be as fine as well. And so this is just a couple of images of that. Again, the idea that there's a very clear lines of sight. It's a secure as. One of the things that we like to do is make sure that people at night can start to feel secure there. So the way in which they're structured is quite important.
Can you go back to his slides, back to your last one? These large buildings in the centre here, what uses are they? Like, what is, are they office buildings or they mixed use? What's the situation?
I don't know. There was no roof. It wasn't even our land. That land had been sold by the council to land lease, and then land lease was sold back to the council and it reacquired it. There was no roof. What we just wanted to make sure that what those buildings are very habitable floor plates. So between about 18 and 25 metres wide, they could be useful as residential buildings, they could be good as commercial projects, they could ideally have some form of retail or engagement or lack of edge at the bottom. But we don't know.
Do you advise the council or whoever's driving this then what they could be in terms of, as you said earlier on, about trying to mix things up? Push with the council saying we need this should be mixed buildings so that we get that.
Yeah. No, we do that, and in fact, in this particular case, there was the Department of Planning, effectively, state government's planning agencies, there was the transport planners, and there was city police that was in this case, all around the table, and saying, oh, right, now we know what to do. And while our agenda in the immediate term was to make sure that anything we did here was right, because that was our mission. Making sure that it can happen. I don't think we're looking like this particularly, but it can't look that dissimilar in some sense. When you get the right plan, you sort of know it's about right. So, yeah, it seems to work quite well. Yep.
You say some architects, some people didn't necessarily comply with that or didn't sort of follow that plan that they wanted to be built in something else. The only reason I ask is because it just happens to be one site for one master hospital.
Oh, okay.
And I just had something completely disparate to that.
Yep.
Which doesn't apply with that. Is there still that sort of sense of flexibility that anyone can
This drawing has no status. We just made it up and drew it and presented it. It has no status whatsoever. Yeah. So we had a very defined site, if you like, in through here. And all of this, in fact, it wasn't even in public hands when we drew this. So it could become a car park, it could become another shopping centre. But the sense is that there's a view that we think that a plan like this allows us to be sure that the station's not making any mistakes. But this is relatively old now, this is 3 or 4 years old. And subsequent to doing this, the council's then gone, oh, we better get a structure plan. But they've missed the boat because the station had been built by the time they did commission the structure plan. So it's a case of the relationships between the various agencies. We can help mediate that. But there's no, this has absolutely no more standing than, the paper it's written on.
But this is a civic gesture.
It's a civic gesture. That was our idea, is that it was actually about public. It wasn't about private. And so the idea that there is, in fact, a series of forecourts created, there are links created, that we have buildings that can front onto it. So we designed it, if you like, as the public space around which we strung a series of necklaces of occupiable space. But I wasn't too worried about what they are, because they'll change. What happens in cities is that most of the buildings get renewed periodically. And so at the older cities, there's virtually nothing left, except the street pattern of 500 years ago, with the exception of the old gym and the old European jewel. So here we are. So this is just some images as it was. Another version that we did at editing further down the track. You'll see that it's sort of some of the language was the same. And this is at Thomastown. And again, Thomastown, we advocated for a new railway station to be built at Thomastown and gave them reasons why it could, and they bought it. And so Thomastown is a new railway station because of the process that we went through, including this sort of urban link that tried to stitch across the rail corridor. So sort of, again, a civic gesture, as Des say. And again, some of our good public work doesn't involve building at all. And so we do quite a lot of master plan and concept work. Again, most of this never sees light of day as a finished product, but that's sort of the nature of it. Everything's provisional and transitional, but the idea of creating place from a combination of existing fabric and new insertions with a bigger idea over it, it's really quite compelling as an activity. So I'd better just watch the time. So in that sense, there's a range of ways in which we think practice is going to change over time, architectural practice. It's changed dramatically in the last 10 years. I think the next 10 years will bring us more rapid change than ever before. But I won't go through some of the things that we talk about here, except to say that working out of your own hometown is going to become more and more the norm. The fact is Australia is a developed country. We actually already have an MCG in Melbourne, for example. We've got a reasonable, rail system. We've got hospitals, and yes, there'll be continued work, but there are parts of the world that are growing so extremely fast with virtually no infrastructure that the need for these design skills exists more out of Australia than it does in Australia. So we might be working on the Christchurch Justice Centre in New Zealand, for example, as part of that rebuild, but in effect, the thing about future cities is that the world is urbanising so fast and so rapidly that the need is one of the few things that we will be sure about in the future. And so in that sense, I'd like to talk more and more about what we do outside of home cities, and I'll talk about a couple of examples of what we can do that, because, people are travellers, people are traders. We've been doing that for millennia. It's how we move, and the idea is really, what does it mean to work outside your home city? I'd been to Adelaide for a weekend with Fiona 30 years before. It was the week before the week I spent there to do the Adelaide Oval, if you like. So you can't rely upon knowing everything when you go into a city, but it's a remarkably audacious act to go into a culture that's not your own and offer an architectural solution. It's quite... it's something you need to be very careful about. We never do it on our own. So we never go into a new city and say, this is what we're doing. We're not going to lay down a particular solution. We always work with people, and we spend a lot of time listening. In fact, we spend a lot more time listening than we do talking when we go here. And so there are all sorts of reasons why we go, why global practice is a difficult thing, but actually it's fantastic. There's great opportunities and we love it. So some of those opportunities we've made manifest. This is the Marina Bay Bridge in Singapore. At the moment, we've got some guys in London who are working on some projects in London, one in Barcelona and a couple in the Middle East. And we've got offices through Southeast Asia. So we think that the need to do good work involves going and exploring new territory. Because don't think that they're not coming here. Zaha Hadid applied, we entered the Casey's Civic Centre competition. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's already happened. So when we've got architects from around the world setting up offices in Australia, the competition's just going to get more and more intense. And so one of the things that we're doing is going back into their towns and doing work ourselves. So I'll just leave you with a couple of examples of projects that we do overseas. One's the Japanese National Stadium competition. You had to be a gold medal architect to enter the competition. It was an international one. We came second, unfortunately. Zaha pipped us on this one, but just some of the imagery of our version here. And again, it's a very, very, very simple thing in terms of what it means to be plonking something down into Tokyo. And the idea that the stands themselves are at timber paces. Yes?
Is that the one they said that they want to build? Zaha one?
Yes. Yep. So she and the Japanese government departed ways about a month ago.
Yeah. Any reason for that?
They're not sure how they're going to procure future work. So we're having some conversations behind the scenes, but that's as far as it gets at this stage. So the idea that there's really some beautiful timber pieces gathered inside this glass prism, this sort of pristine prism, for people to come together. Again, a very, very, very simple concept, and one that we'd like to generate at some point. But again, when you're in the world of public architecture, you do 10 schemes for everyone that gets up. So you've got to be an optimist to do it. But this is, if you like, a typical example of what people imagine is a sort of heroic thrust of global practice and so forth. It's actually not like that at all. It's very personal and it's very intimate, and it requires, you know, very small groups of people putting intelligence and enthusiasm to the task in a very careful manner. And so one of the other, and again, I won't spend long on this because I think I'm probably nearly out of time, but the idea here is that this is something that's very different when you talk about global architecture. Kuching's the capital of Sarawak in Borneo, East Malaysia, and centre of the city's here. And in fact, there's a site here which is about the same size as the Melbourne CBD. Effectively, in through here, this is subject to flooding. It's almost like a refugee camp in some senses where people have come and gathered. And there's always, the culture is always welcome family in, so as families come into the city, we've got 9 families, for example, living in a two-room house in there, and twice a year it comes through waist high in the floodwaters, for example. So this is the site itself, and again, I won't convert this into a planning lecture per se, but it's a pretty audacious request to have happened. We had some people had organised to come in and see us in the city. Patrick and I had a number of Chinese delegations through, and it's all a bit turgid, to be frank. And anyhow, we had this group from Borneo, and we've sort of rolled our collective eyes and gone up to have a chat with them. And there were 14 people, they were all much better dressed than we were. They spoke better English than even Patrick or myself. Most of them, in fact, 50% of them had PhDs from places like, you know, Oxford and Texas and Adelaide and all over the town. Very erudite, very focused. They knew what they wanted to do. They hadn't done a research on the residents in this area. They interviewed every single one of the 15,000. So they knew exactly what they were dealing with, and they were desperately searching for some ideas on how to engage what they were telling them they wanted with what they needed to produce. So without going into it, you can start to see just how, I mean, everyone's terrified of fire in here. It just wiped out the lot. So everyone was very worried about how that could start to come forward. You can see where the flood inundation is. So that's the site, and bingo, not a good place. Workshops, promote, you know, working up schemes live around the table. Dealing with the culture of a workshop in Malaysia is very different from the culture of a workshop here. I won't go on about that. I can continue to talk about that. The ideas of the various structure plans and how they did come together finally. Where again, starting question: where are your jobs? You know, one of the sub issues here was great unemployment, lack of education, dissolute youth, and so forth, growing crime rates, and so forth. So start to look at all of those components. But one of the real issues for us was how do people want to live? In that sense, and everyone refers to the kampungs and how delightful they are. And so we spent a lot of time talking with people about what the kampung was. And the kampung is just it's an incredibly delightful way of living. It's just fantastic. And so this is a traditional village, if you like, in Borneo. But of course, what they want is they want to live in a kampung. They don't want to pay for it, of course. By the way, I've got a 4-wheel drive and, you know, internet access and a satellite phone. I need to put, so I need to be able to lock the door and leave because I work in KL every second week. So there's a real disparate about how you deal with the contemporary and the historic, if you like. And so again, a bit like the Adelaide Oval, we looked at the attributes of this as distinct from the architecture of it. The idea of what that meant as an urban village, how it was very responsive to their particular sites. They had tuned them relative to how they came. The idea that there is centre and facilities where people gather around and come into a central whole. The idea of connectivity is important. And within the housing themselves, the idea of the structure of arrival and approach and a series of layered places into which you can move from the public to the private. And there was all sorts of key indicators that you wouldn't know here about what forms your place and what forms my place. And it could be a post or a stick or something that's understood by everyone that it's so-and-so's place on the other side of that. But the idea of that threshold and transition, the permeability and the environmental design and so forth. And the idea really being is that we could start to come up with a whole cascading series of scale and also a cascading series of the relationship between public and private. And so the idea that there would in fact be a neighbourhood centre where jobs could be undertaken, they would have their sarai there, and the idea that that's their public centre space, and then moving out into different forms of housing that allow different family units and how the evolution of the family unit changes. So you might have a couple, they may have children. What happens to the grandparents? Suddenly the kids have children, and on it goes. And so the ability to expand and contract the living space, and also have a series of thresholds into which, as family gets more and more intimate, you can start to be invited further into the threshold of the houses. And so that idea, if you like, is more to do with what we would describe as a contemporary kampong, as distinct from trying to do a thatched roof and work out where we're going to park the four-wheel drive. And so we ended up with the first stage really as being the village centre in through here, and then a series of different housing types to match the different requirements coming through. And again, very, very early day stuff. It's not designed, it's still an idea, but we can see how that idea can start to deal with multiple use of levels, the idea of an active ground plane, inhabited spaces, private, public, and a whole series of transitions between public and private. And then, of course, how you start to advocate that and the public processes that you need to go through to get approvals for this and so forth. So it's a very time-intensive and very delightful thing to do. But that's sort of the full circle in that sense in terms of what it means to be involved in public architecture. It's less, in our view, to do with the architecture, not because that's not critical, it's our secret passion. We often need to do sort of furtive means to get a good project up, but it's actually about the city and the social constructs and understanding those, so you can then produce a building that has the meaning and responsiveness over time that the city really needs. That's it. Thank you.